Donald Trump threw the idea that he wants to make Canada part of the United States. And some people took him seriously. On the other side, people thought that's just ridiculous because that is never going to happen. But here in this video, I'm going to show you Donald Trump's plan, how he can possibly make Canada part of the United States. But it's not going to be easy. In fact, it might cause a real economic crisis in Canada. Yeah. The situation with the Canadian economy right now is not easy. A lot of people suffering. Prices are all over the place. It's impossible to buy a house in Canada, and the internet is filled with videos about how it's getting extremely impossible for the vast majority of population, even people who are making over $100,000 to live in Canada. But I'm about to tell you that it might actually get significantly worse. But in order to understand what is happening and in order to understand Trump's plan, we have to take a look slightly at how the Canadian economy is built versus the US economy. United States have already tried multiple times to take over Canada back in the days, and you can read out the history. And the United States wanted to make Canada part of the US, but it was unsuccessful. And for a long time, these two countries wanted to exist with each other. You see, the problem with Canada is that it is probably its biggest problem, the fact that Canada has a very small population of 40 million people. In fact, most of these people came to Canada in the last 20 years because their situation was way worse 20 years ago. While if you compare that to the US, that has a population of 335. So when you have two countries, one is filled with a huge population, while the other country, just to give you some context, Canada overall is bigger than the United States. And a lot of people don't know that, even though that Canada has 10 times less population than the entire United States. So part of the US strategy for a very long time was to take over the territory that Canada has. Especially right now, the Arctic is becoming even more important, and the United States, it has claim to the Arctic because it controls Alaska. But if the United States is going to take over Canada, for example, it is going to have a much bigger claim. Right now, it is mostly controlled by Russia and Denmark because these two countries have been investing in the Arctic for so many years. But United States have been behind all of that. What is important to understand here is that Canada needs people. And if you take a look at the birth rate, is around 1.3%. And that has been the case for a very long time. This is not a situation or a problem that Canada got in the last 10 or 15 years. This problem has been there for since about 1970s. And if we go with this kind of birth rate, then Canada over time is not even going to have a 40 million people, but rather 20 million people. So if you have a country with 350 million people and its neighbor has a much bigger territory but has just 20 million people, you can already see the consequences of that problem. So if the birth rates will continue the way they are right now, Canada by the year 2100 is going to have around 20 million people, and the United States population have been growing steadily because the United States is a much larger country when it comes to population, and it has a much larger economy, and more people tend to immigrate to the United States compared to Canada. And because the United States already have its own population, regardless of the birth rates, there are far more people being born in the United States than Canada, and it will take a while for Canada to catch up the United States. But if you take a look at the projections, the US population is tend to grow to 400 million people by around the year 2100. Now, this is just projected because if the inflow of immigrants is going to be higher, this number could go as high as 450 million people. So if you have on one side 20 million people versus 450 million people, then this 20 million people will sooner or later somehow join the United States of America and become the 51st state. Now, Canada perfectly understands that it is extremely vulnerable and they don't want to actually be part of the United States because they want to defend their country and be Canada. Now, in order to fix this problem, you simply have to bring more people to Canada. So you need to bring people from all across the globe to live in Canada. And it's not an easy job because you don't want to simply and randomly bring people from all across the globe. You want to bring people that would fit within your economy. And Canada has a very advanced economy. It has one of the highest GDP per capita. So you want to make sure that you bring people, skilled people from different countries that will immigrate to Canada and will be working at a very high skilled jobs. That is the goal. Because if you randomly bring people without that background, then it might destroy your entire economy. And that has been the plan of Canada. In fact, there is something that we call Century Initiative. This is Canada's plan to grow the Canadian economy to 100 million people by the year 2100. So they understand that this is a threat, and if we don't grow our population to at least 100 million people by the year 2100, it is going to be a danger to the existence of Canada. And that is why, if you are wondering why Canada is accepting so many immigrants, it's not because Canada is so generous. It's not because Canada is so welcoming. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to take the credit out of Canada for being so welcoming to so many immigrants, actually. But if you look at it from the geopolitical perspective and a strategic perspective in the long run, then Canada understands that it has no other choice but to bring people to its country and grow its population. Otherwise, its population is going down. And if by the year 100, its population is going to reach 20 million people, in the next 50 years, it is going to go to 10 million people. And then you have this vast country that is being inhabited by just 10 million people. Who is going to take that country? One of the European powers? Or maybe your closest neighbor, the United States. But if you look at the projections, right now, the Canadian population is growing by around 1%, and by that year, they will not achieve this goal. It is pretty much impossible, even though that they are trying to do that. Now, I can't tell you right now for a fact because we have many decades to go until the year 2100. But based on the projections that we have, it might go to around 65 million people. And the only way they're fueling this growth is through immigration. Now, another thing you want to do in order to defend yourself against the United States is you want to have a very strong economy. Now, everybody knows that with few people, you can't build such a large economy. Yes, you can make your economy very advanced. You can make your economy very productive. You can be a really leading power, such as Singapore or some of the smaller countries. But these small countries don't have any real influence. You need to have a lot of people. And the second thing you want to do is that you want to have money or capital flow into your country. So a lot of people, a lot of capital flowing into Canada, making Canada strong so that it makes no sense or it will not give any chance to the United States to ever take Canada and make it part of the United States. This is the plan, and it seems very simple. It's very straightforward. More money comes to Canada, more money being invested in the Canadian economy, more money in circulation, driving the economy forward, bringing more people into Canada, making Canada more wealthier, and it can compete with the United States to a certain extent. Sounds very reasonable. But when you do that, it has consequences. And one of the consequences is demand. Imagine you have 100 people buying stuff in this small neighborhood, and you bring an extra 100 people, and now we have 200 people, but you have the exact same number of goods within that neighborhood. What do you think happens to prices? Prices suddenly increase because the demand for those prices suddenly went dramatically higher. Why? Because yesterday we had 100 people, today we have 200 people. So if you're wondering why it becomes so expensive to live in Canada, it's not a coincidence. They knew that if they bring so many people, prices are going to go up. And it's not to blame those people for such actions. They took those actions as a result of national security of Canada, and they wanted to grow the Canadian economy. But this is one of the consequences. Now, the second thing was that house prices grew dramatically high. Of course, more people come into your country. The demand for rent is going to increase, and if rent prices increase, then house prices also increase. But you don't always rent. A lot of people come and they immigrate fully into Canada. They go to the banks, they take a mortgage, and they try to buy a house in order for them to build equity over the course of the period that they will be living in Canada, and then pass down that house to their kids, and that's how they build wealth. House prices increase again because now we have more people actually getting mortgages. But there is one more thing that Canada did in order to destroy house prices in Canada. And that is, how do you attract capital? How do you make sure that rich people from all across the globe, they will bring their money and they will invest it in Canada? One of the best ways to do that is to become a tech hub, and people look at your country and they're like, wait a second, there are so many great AI companies in Canada. Let's invest. Like, why do you think so many people from all across the globe, not just like the United States, they invest in companies that emerge out of San Francisco? Because San Francisco is the tech hub of the world. And a lot of people want to make money by investing in those startups. But Canada does not have that. And I'm not saying that there are not any startups in Canada, but that's absolutely nothing if you compare it to the United States. If you compare it to just California, I'm not talking about even the entire United States, because there are far more startups in the whole country than just one city. So if you can't bring money to your country because you don't have startups, what do? You make it easier for people to buy houses in your country. So they will take all that money from their country, China, India, Middle East, Southeast Asia, and they're like, let's buy a house in Canada, because Canada is safe, because Canada is close to the United States, Canada is advanced. We might even live in Canada because Canada has such an easy immigration policy compared to the United States. If you can't move to the US, just move to Canada. And if you need anything from the US, it's just an hour flight or maybe 2 hours flight, depends on where you're actually traveling to. Makes sense, right? It's as easy as that. There is literally, the border is very close. For example, from Vancouver to the northern part of the United States. Now, another thing happens when you bring so much people into your country is that employment goes up, because everybody wants to work. There are not enough jobs for people. And if you're a business, yesterday you had like 2 people fighting for one job. Now we have 10 people fighting for the exact same job. What do? You bring your salaries down. Now you're paying less for the exact same job, even though that prices went up. And that's why it becomes extremely impossible for most people to live in Canada. You as a business owner, there is like so much competition in the market. Why would you pay more? I mean, why would you pay more to this person when an immigrant just came to Canada and you can pay him half of that and he will do the exact same job? Especially Canada has been very smart about its immigration. They have been trying to bring very skilled people. And when people immigrate from one country to another, they don't do that when they're little kids. They don't do that when they're very extremely old. The people who immigrate from one place to another are typically the kind of people between the age of 20 to 40. This is the age of when you're working. This is the age when you already studied in university or in school. You have some basic skills. You probably have like master degrees, PhD, or anything like that. And you can go and do your professional job. And that is why people are complaining about life in Canada. It's not a coincidence. So the implications of Canada's laws and regulations have led to these 3 consequences that created the financial crisis that Canada is facing right now, with its housing prices, with its prices all over the entire economy, and the difficulty to get a job that pays the bills. So what is the plan of the United States in order to completely obliterate the Canadian economy and make sure that Canada will come to the United States? Canada will come to Trump and will say, please accept us as a part of the United States, and we are ready to become the 51st state of the United States. I think people from Canada are watching this video, they're gonna hate me for saying something like that, but this is the true reality. This is what happens. Have you seen what Trump has been telling the Trudeau when he actually met him for the first time? He literally called him like the governor. He literally called him governor of Canada, not the prime minister of Canada. So in the back of his head, Trump made it clear that Canada is part of the United States. And I'm going to give you some numbers and you will see why Trump is treating it like that. So here's the plan. If you look at the entire Canadian economy, there are 3 main industries. The first and the most important industry of Canada is, of course, oil and gas. And it supplies mostly the northern part of the United States with oil. Maybe not much with gas, but with oil and electricity. And it's one of the main industries. If that industry goes down, then Canada is actually very, very doomed. And Canada has one of the largest reserves of oil in the world. It's one of the reasons that Canada is so insanely rich compared to most of the countries around the globe. The second industry that makes Canada such a powerful economy is the automotive industry. because Canada builds a lot of cars. Toyota, General Motors, a lot of American car companies are building their cars in Canada for very different reasons. One of the reasons is, of course, those countries want to diversify their productions. They don't want to make everything in the United States because it's politics. Something could change tomorrow, and it's better to actually have part of your production in other countries. So General Motors or Ford, they have their production in Mexico and Canada. Another thing is, of course, even though that Canada is not cheap labor, Canada is actually much poorer compared to the United States. Like the Canadian GDP per capita is $53,000, while the US GDP per capita is over $80,000. And you can see the difference. Now, another thing that people or their companies in the US realize is that Canada has a very loose immigration policy, and they're bringing so many people. So those so many people can be paid much less than you can pay people in the United States. So why not diversify our production and bring part of that production to the United States? I mean, bring part of that production to Canada. That's why so many companies ended up being in Canada, especially when the United States has a free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. Now, the third most important industry in Canada is mining and resources. If you look at everything that Canada sells to the rest of the world, it literally extracts all of those natural resources and starts selling it to the United States mostly. Of course, the US is not the only client of Canada. You also have Japan, China, European Union, and a long list of other countries, but the United States is by far its biggest client. So if you make sure that these three entire industries that Canada has and depends on them as its economy, and you make them rely on the United States, suddenly the US have so much leverage over Canada. And that's exactly what the US did. Over the last, I don't know how many years, probably the last couple of hundred of years, Canada became so dependent on the United States that Canada did not itself realize how dependent they are. Now, let me give you some examples. Look at this. These are the exports of Canada to the rest of the world, and they total to around almost $600 billion, which is a lot. A third of that are the minerals, oil and gas and everything related to that, which is at around 31.4%. The second biggest section is, of course, automotive, which stands at around 20%, I guess, if you total it up. When I'm talking about the automotive industry, I don't just mean cars. There are parts of the cars, such as engines. There are different parts of cars besides engines as well. So they produce all of that and then supply to the United States, which is the largest market in the world, not just for cars, but for a lot of things. And I want you to look at everything else that Canada exports to the rest of the world, and you can see that paper, aluminium, fertilizers, and all of these things supposed to go to the rest of the world, making the Canadian economy so strong. But when you look at the other side of the equation, suddenly realize that 75% of all of this goes into the United States. So United States buying everything from Canada, giving Canada the money in order for them to boost their economy, invest in different kind of infrastructure projects, buy things from all across the globe. So if tomorrow United States stops buying Canadian goods and services, what will happen to Canada? I don't even mean services. We are talking about goods, because Canada extracts these resources from under the ground and then sells it to the United States. And now US stops buying all of that. Canada will lose 75% of the money that comes into Canada. I'm not talking about 10, 20, 30%. We are not even talking about like 50%. We are literally talking about 75% of money that goes into Canada comes from the United States. So when Trump says that we are going to impose a 20% tariff on all these goods, or it was probably 25%, I don't exactly remember at this point, but you understand the problem, right? Suddenly all of these products that come to the US become less competitive, and Canadian businesses will start going down and will go out of business one after another. That is how dangerous it is to the Canadian economy. So when Trump went out and he signed this executive orders in order to put these tariffs on Canada, he was very confident that I hold all the costs. Like, you guys stand no chance. You literally stand absolutely no chance. You will come to us and you will agree to any terms and conditions that we have. On the other side, let's take a look at the imports, because a country isn't just about exporting things, right? Canada imports a lot of things. And what does Canada import? Of course, machinery, anything related to that. Canada imports a lot of cars and trucks from the United States, and a long list of other products that countries often import. And who is the largest country from where Canada imports its products? Exactly, the United States. 56% of all the imports of Canada come from the United States. It gives a lot of leverage to the United States over Canada. And it seems like Canada without the United States can't even function at all. And if you look at the states within the United States, you will find out that some of their economies look exactly like the Canadian economy, because the United States is a huge country and it trades with the rest of the world. You have some states, for example, are focused on tech, such as California. Then you have other states that are focused on agricultural products. Then you have states that are focused on building cars, and they produce these cars and then they ship them to the rest of the world. They sell them in the European Union. They sell them in Canada. And with the numbers you have over here, it's no different than any other state within the United States, even though that Canada is not part of the United States. So if you're actually wondering why Trump is so confident about the fact that he can make Canada part of the United States, these are the numbers that you simply have to take a look at. And now let's take a look at Trump's plan. United States have already done a great job over the last 100 years to make Canada so reliant on the United States. And now Trump is going just to put the last nail in the coffin and obliterate the Canadian economy. He started with tariffs, around 25% tariffs, to start negotiating with Canada. And everybody understood that this is just a negotiating tactic. And by the time you're watching this video, of course, everybody knows that they actually put all these tariffs on hold in order to start negotiating. So the question is that, what can Trump possibly get from these negotiations in order to obliterate the Canadian economy and make it part of the United States? One of the things that he can do is to stop Canadian government subsidizing and regulating some of its industries. Most of the countries around the globe, they have a set of rules in order to make sure that their key industries are not being controlled by a foreign entity or by a foreign country. So if you're Canada, one of your main sectors is the financial sector. So you have a list of banks that are directly working with the government, and the Canadian government has control over its financial sector, over its banking sector. You don't want foreign banks to come to your country. Yes, you want them to come, you want them to actually work within your country, but you want the Canadian banks to have the upper hand. You want them to be bigger and stronger. But if you take any Canadian bank, and you compare it to a bank like JP Morgan, and you compare it to a bank like Citibank, and you compare it to a bank like, Chase, they stand no chance, because the assets within those US banks are so enormously massive that they can crush any Canadian banks. So the only reason that Canada can hold its financial sector is because of the laws and regulations that the government has passed in order to give an advantage for Canadian banks to dominate the Canadian economy. And Trump can change that. Trump can say, listen, you want the tariffs to be lifted? You don't want tariffs on you? Let's do this. You will take out these regulations, like you're going to just cancel these regulations. You're going to stop giving subsidies to some of these companies who are actually extracting oil from your country. Canada has oil, a lot of oil, and in order for that sector to flourish, the government of Canada is providing subsidies to these oil and gas companies that are Canadian oil and gas companies to extract that oil. So if US companies will come to Canada, they have no chance to compete with them, because the US government cannot provide subsidies for these companies to extract oil from Canada. But Canada can do that for its own local manufacturers. Suddenly, US companies cannot compete in the Canadian economy. So one of the tools that he can actually negotiate is to say that if you don't want tariffs, please lift all of these regulations in order for the US companies to come to your country. And guess what happens over the next 10, 20, or 30 years? Suddenly, there are no major Canadian banks controlling Canada, because now Canadian financial sector depends on JP Morgan, on Chase, on Wells Fargo. Suddenly, the oil that's being extracted in Canada is no longer being done by the Canadian companies, but rather done by ExxonMobil, by other US oil companies. Now, another thing he can do is by increasing the imports. One of the things that Trump consistently mentioned that there is a very huge trade imbalance between Canada and the United States. So we are buying far more from Canada than Canada is buying from us. And that makes no sense. That is not equal business. So what we can do is that let Canada buy from us as much as we're buying from them. But if Canada starts buying more from the United States than it buys from the rest of the world, then its share of, a percentage of imports from the United States will rise from 56% to, I don't know, it can go to 80%, 90%, 100%. Imagine everything being imported to Canada is being imported from the United States. Why? Because Canada cannot buy from China. It can buy from China, but Donald Trump gonna tell him, listen, you want to buy from China, but you have a trade deficit with us. How do you close the trade deficit? You start buying from the United States. You don't buy from China. So over time, Canada will become even more reliant on the United States. And one day, maybe 10 years from now, after these negotiations, 90% of Canadian imports will come from United States. And United States will have a much stronger leverage over Canada. Now, a third most important thing that they can negotiate is immigration. Remember I told you in the beginning of the video about Canada's plan in order to increase its population to 100 million people so they can stand as a nation, so United States will never swallow Canada. But part of that, or the only way that Canada can do that, is by letting people to come to Canada and by loosening out immigration. When you make it easy for people to immigrate to your country, more people will naturally immigrate to the country, especially when you're Canada and you're rich and wealthy and you have so much resources and you're bordering the United States. One of the negotiation tactics and the tools and the goals that Trump can use is to say, listen, no more immigration to Canada. You can let it to a certain extent, but not as much as it has been for the last 10 or 15 years, where 500,000 people would immigrate to Canada. And over time, the Canadian population is not going to increase as much as it could possibly be with the current rules and the regulations when it comes to immigration that Canada has. So while Trump was bluffing when it comes to tariffs, he wanted to get something else. And I personally believe that these are the three things that Trump is trying to get out of Canada in order to make Canada even more reliant on the United States. So what's the future of Canada? If the population is not going to increase, but rather is going to decrease if they literally change the immigration. By the way, the moment I'm recording this video, Canada have already changed its immigration policy, and now it's much more difficult to immigrate to Canada than it was like last year, for example, or 2 years from now, or 2 years ago, or 5 years ago. So that might not change, and the Canadian population will stagnate, and that goal of 65 million people by the year 2100 might not possibly happen. Now, I can't tell you what will happen in the future, because 4 years from now, everything could change. The Canadian government can start taking different actions when the administrations in the United States is going to change. Secondly, 90% dependence on the United States. So if all the imports will come from the United States, then Canada is like, listen, we are part of the United States because we are no different than California. We are no different than Detroit. We are no different than New York. Another important thing could be is that more US companies will control Canada. American companies are already in Canada, but not to an extent that they can be if the Canadian government is going to shift or lift out those subsidies from the local companies. So maybe 10 years from now or 15 years from now, if they're going to continue with these policies, Canada will be much more reliant on the United States. And I wouldn't be surprised if they will actually do a referendum, because a new party could emerge in Canada and they can say, listen, we are so integrated within the US economy that it makes no more sense for us to be independent. So let's make a referendum if the Canadian people want to be part of the United States. Or it could be slightly different, or the United States can push this referendum into Canada without actually any kind of wars or anything similar to that. They can create a referendum just like they did with Brexit in United Kingdom to leave the European Union, but it would be the other way around, where Canadian people will go and vote whether they want to be part of the United States. And if 51% of Canadian people want to be part of the US, that's it. Canada becomes part of the United States. Of course, these are some hypothetical ideas that I'm talking to you about, but if you take a look at what's happening on the ground, suddenly you realize that United States has been working over this for a very long time. So the situation with the Canadian economy is most likely going to get a lot worse than it's right now, because the trade war will continue until the point where the US companies will be able to come to Canada and dominate those industries. So one of the questions that people might have in mind is that, how can I profit from this transition? How can I profit from this change? You see, every time there is any major event in the world, there is a transition of wealth from one people to another, from one group to another. When there is a war, when there is any major event, when there is a financial crisis. And if you want to profit from this, then you have to think about yourself. Which are the companies that have the best chance to profit from this transition? How am I able to start investing in those companies? So if you want to profit from it, you have to think and prepare yourself right now. You should start investing, you should start buying the right assets, you should start educating yourself. And if you just started investing, or you're exploring your investing options and you're thinking, how can I start buying the right assets? How do I know which stocks to buy? How do I know which companies are actually going to profit and which companies are simply bubbles that I should avoid? Or what is the best investing strategy for me? Then check the first link in the description that will answer all of your questions. Thanks guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.